All right, so guys, what we want to do today, we've come to a point in our quasi conversation here that's going to at least bring us to a point of monotheism, to a question of, well, what next then? We've went through particular arguments that have at least led up to a belief that there's possibly a God, hopefully more solidified than that, especially if you check some of the sources, go back, study some of those arguments with the people that you may be discussing these topics with as you watch this series. But now we come to a point, what have we got specifically? Now this is where we would want to come into the area of the Scriptures. What is the case, or what is the historical reliability, if you want to ask it that way, of the New Testament text? Is there any reason to believe that these texts are historically reliable? And if so, what is that? What is that data or that evidence? So that's what we're going to look at. But of course, because we try to take seriously any sort of philosophical presupposition or any worldview issue that may be undergirding certain objections, we want to address those. So one of those may be, let's say that if we're looking at something in the past, if we're looking at history, because obviously the New Testament text has lent itself to an investigation of their reliability because we have them as a text before us. So what might be an objection? Well, a philosophical predilection or presupposition or assumption that is underwriting that may be that, well, you can't know history. You can't know history. It doesn't matter what the text may say. It doesn't matter how reliable the text may necessarily be. You just can't know history. You weren't there. Of course, the first difficulty with that sort of view or that sort of objection would be then you can't say that Christianity is not true, or that you can't say that the Christian text is not reliable. Well, why? Because of course, in order to say that you can't know what happened, you would have to know what happened in order to say that the Christian text got it wrong. In fact, you would have to say, we know what the text says, or we know the actual historical event that did happen, because this is wrong in relation to that. But if you can't know history, well then that objection falls to pieces. You can't say that Christianity is wrong. On the other hand, if you can say that Christianity is wrong, well then you would at least have to know something about history. And if we can know things about history, then we have to take serious the claims that the New Testament makes as far as a historical document, as far as their reliability may go. So what we want to do is look at that. What do we have? Now, the way that we want to present that is we want to look at this text as if it's not inspired, as if it's not the Word of God, or as if it's not Holy Scripture, or anything that would fall into any of those genres. We would just look at this as a historical document. Just look at it as a document. Now, if we're going to look at something as a historical document, well, another objection may be, well, wait a minute, we can't look at this as a historical document because it contains miracles. It's all this supernatural ridiculousness tied throughout its pages that we can't take that as serious. But again, remember, we've already addressed that particular topic of miracle. The only difficulty that may be that may reside with that is the fact that, wait a minute, that has nothing to do with the text. That has everything to do with your philosophical presupposition or your worldview. But again, as we've already shown with that particular argument for miracles, if miracles are possible, then you still just have to deal with what the text says. You can't just rule out a priori that miracles, we can't trust this because there's miracles. We've already dealt with that. Miracles may be possible. In fact, if those arguments hold, then miracles are possible. So you're going to have to deal with what the text says in regard to miracles. It has nothing to do with what the text itself says. It has everything to do with your own worldview. We've already dealt with that. You can go back and check that if you'd like and discuss that. All right, just quickly before we move on, another objection may be that we don't have access to all the facts. Again, that's just not a problem. What we're concerned with is if we just have enough evidence to test these documents in relation to other historical events, to see if they're just generally reliable. Because remember, scientists, whoever else it may be, they don't have to have access to all the facts. They just have to have enough access, or access to enough facts, rather, to be able to piece together some particular position for a particular topic or event or what have you. So with that said, we'll just continue to move on. So what we want to do here is we have some notes before us because these numbers change dramatically every few years. So we have to keep the most up to date. We want to be the most honest that we can be with these manuscripts that we'll be talking about. So when we talk about manuscripts, what we're saying is, what kind of evidence do we have? What kind of copies? What kind of historical documentation do we have for the life of Jesus? Now what we want to do is look at that in comparison or in contrast, compare and contrast with other ancient documents that we have information for, that we have evidence for, or historical events that are attested to by these other ancient documents. Now Gary Habermas has put together, he's done extensive research on this topic. Again, we'll list some sources so that you'll be able to go through those. But he's put together basically what are called 12 known facts, or 12 historical facts that the gamut of scholarship agrees on. Now, when I say that the scholarship, I don't mean just people that believe the New Testament text. I mean people that don't necessarily believe the text, people that do believe the text. I've come to roughly these 12 facts that are just uncontested by the majority of scholarship. The first would be this. In a span of 150 years of Jesus' life, we have 9 references to Tiberius Caesar. And of course, he's the Roman emperor, the leader of the most powerful nation at the time of at that time frame in history. Now, we have 9 references to Tiberius Caesar. Now, in the same 150-year span, we have 10 references to Jesus of a tiny town called Nazareth. We have 10 references to Jesus. We have 9 references to Tiberius Caesar. So at this point, we're not even using Christian sources. At this point in our argument, we're just using any and extra biblical sources. Some of these would be even what would be called enemy attestation, or those that don't even necessarily agree with, or even like the term says, enemies of the Christian faith. We're looking at those sources. So what may those be? Well, first, again, in the same 150-year span, we have 10 references to Jesus of Nazareth. There's more attestation to Christ, the historical person of Jesus, than there is to the Roman emperor at that time. Just that should speak volumes, at least to the historical person of Jesus. Now, these references are Josephus. Now, a lot of people automatically say, wait a minute, Josephus, that's been proven to be a forgery, or that's been proven to be doctored to some extent. Now, we can go with that. Okay, let's say that it's been doctored. But the historical core of that information from Josephus has been shown to be reliable. But also, there's also another account by Josephus. And again, we'll put up some information so you can look into that further. So we have Josephus' 2 accounts, not just the one. We have Tacitus, we have Lucian, we have Suetonius, we have Pliny the Younger, we have Thales, Celsus, Phlegon, Mara, Marcipian, even the Jewish Talmud. So we're not looking at just one particular source that's outside of the New Testament or outside of Christian documentation. These are outside of that. And we still have more attestation to the person or the historical person of Christ than we do Caesar. Now again, some of these sources are even considered to be anti-Christian sources. And again, we can put up the 10 secular writer attestation for those sources. From these secular sources, with absolutely no Christian or theological agenda or spin, there are 12 huge facts that are attested to. And this is where we want to really look at these facts that are outside of the Christian documents. These are, again, just from outside sources that are not Christian. Check this out. Obviously from these sources we have that this Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. We have that this Jesus lived a somewhat virtuous life, that this Jesus was supposedly a wonder worker, that this Jesus had a brother named James, that this Jesus was acclaimed to be the Messiah, that this Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, that this Jesus was crucified on the eve of Passover. Now get this, again, from a secular source, from an outside Christian source, we have this fact, that darkness and an earthquake occurred when this person died, when this Jesus died, that we have his disciples were willing to die for the belief that this Jesus was something extra special, more than just a man, that Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome, and lastly, we have his disciples denied the Roman gods and worship Jesus as God on penalty of death. Now again, that is just from the sources that we have are outside of the New Testament or any Christian text or any Christian source. That itself, again, we just can't say loudly enough, should speak volumes, because that is essentially the template that matches the New Testament claim about Jesus. That he lived in Nazareth, that he died from being crucified, that he did this under Pontius Pilate, that he was a wonder worker, that he worked miracles, that his disciples worshipped him as God. This is essentially the template that we have from the New Testament itself except outside of the New Testament. So, how does the manuscript evidence keep coming back to this translation of a translation of a translation? What are the facts in regard to that claim that we don't necessarily have anything close to what the original Bible or the original New Testament would have looked like in time past? What are the claims? What are the facts in regard to those claims? Now, what we want to do is we want to look at this manuscript evidence and look at how this compares to any other ancient work or any of the other works in antiquity, rather. How does the New Testament compare to that? Now, the best that we have in history, the best work from antiquity that we have is Homer's Iliad. Now, again, these are the numbers that change periodically every few years. Homer's Iliad was the best that the ancient world had to offer as far as the time gap from when the original piece was composed and when the first manuscripts start to show up. So what that just means to say is Homer wrote the Iliad at this point in time. Then here, this particular amount of time goes by before we have any copy. Manuscript is just a fancy word for the copy. This amount of time goes by before we have any copy of this work from the time that it was originally composed and from the time that the copies of that work start to show up. So roughly, Homer has about 1,700 so manuscripts, which is a lot. Because remember, that's the best that antiquity has to offer in regards to the documentation between what Homer wrote, how many copies of it we have. There's about 1,700 copies of the Iliad between the time that it was written, between the time that these copies start to show up. Now, what is the time frame? How much time goes by between when he wrote the piece from when it shows up? About 400 or 500 years is the time gap there. So between the time Homer wrote the Iliad, when the manuscripts start to show up, about 400 or 500 years. That is the best that antiquity has to offer. Now, how does the New Testament compare to that? Homer has about 1,700 manuscripts, about 400 or 500 years between that. There's a couple scholars that say actually the New Testament it should be called an embarrassment of riches compared to anything in antiquity. The New Testament, just the Greek manuscripts alone, because we have all sorts of other languages, Coptic, Syriac, Ethiopian, Gothic, many other languages, Latin, but just the Greek manuscripts. The New Testament has roughly 5,700 manuscripts, and the time gap shrinks to about 40 years or so. Now you've got the best antiquity with Homer, 1,700 manuscripts compared to 5,700 manuscripts of the New Testament. The time gap for Homer's Iliad, about 400 or 500 years, the time gap shrinks to literally a generation with the New Testament records. Now let's look at other works of antiquity that aren't necessarily the best, but that other works that we use on a regular basis to establish or to believe events that happen in history. So from these, some of these are Caesar's work, the Gallic Wars. We have roughly 251 manuscripts and about 950 or 1,000 years in between the time that Caesar wrote this, that chronicles these wars. We've got only 251 of these manuscripts, about 1,000-year gap. Nobody disregards or tosses out the historical reliability of that. Now think about this, the works of Plato. Most of everybody is familiar with Plato, whether you're a philosophy major or a history major or not. Everybody's familiar with Plato. Some of the information that we have contained within his works. We have about 210 manuscripts, and we have about 1,300 years time gap in between when those 250 manuscripts that we have and the time frame in which they were composed. Now Tacitus, who gives us all sorts of history in regard to Rome itself, we have about 30 manuscripts, and again, about 1,000 years in between that. 30 manuscripts, 1,000 years. And we're looking at the New Testament, 5,700 manuscripts just in the Greek, and less than a generation with when they start to show up, that we find them. We could go on and on. We could talk about Pliny the Elder. We could talk about Demosthenes. We could talk about Sophocles. We could talk about Livy. There's just so many more, but we don't even have to name those because the New Testament, as far as the historical reliability is concerned, if we're just going to judge that by any other ancient work of antiquity and how we know things in regard to the historical past based on those works, the New Testament just blows us away. In fact, when I said earlier, if you add the other languages, we were just using the Greek manuscripts. If we add the Coptic, the Syriac, the Georgian, the Ethiopian, all the New Testament manuscripts jump up to about 25,000 manuscripts. Now, another piece of evidence that's just as important to consider, let's pretend that we lose all of that. Let's say that, for instance, the Emperor Diocletian issued an edict roughly around the year 300 to destroy as much Christian paraphernalia that they could get their hands on. Destroy all the texts that they could, get rid of Christian stuff. Let's say that he had succeeded. Roughly that was from around 300 to 311, 312 AD, something like that. Let's say that during that time period that everything that they could get that had itself to do with the information regarding Jesus of Nazareth, any document, any historical text, that was destroyed. Here's something that's very key. You could still reconstruct almost the entire New Testament by going down to your local library, if they have any of the works of the early church fathers. The New Testament was quoted so often and so much that just from the works of the historical church fathers, you could reconstruct almost the entire New Testament. If we had no New Testaments, no biblical data, if all of that was gone, save the works of the church fathers, you could reconstruct almost the entire New Testament just from their works, just from their quotations of the text alone. Period. Now again, back to miracles. Some may say, let's just go back very quickly to this objection about miracles. Well, there's all of these other historical accounts of people with miracles, say other faiths that have these miracles that are attached to their biography, so to speak. Actually, that's just not true. We don't have any other religious figure in history that has any recorded miracles attached to them past a few hundred years or so. Jesus is the only person that within this time frame of the documents about his life that have miracles in accord recorded with his person in this time frame. No other religious history or figure in history rather comes close to that. There's not another one. These show up decades and decades and decades later after what we would have in relation to Jesus of Nazareth. All right, so in regards to any other religious figure, we don't have any miracle documentation or any attestation in regard to that person's life, the documents that concern that religious figure's life. We don't have any miracles attached to that person within a generation of his lifetime at all. So Jesus is again alone in that regard. Again, we're not trying to say that it's true. We're just looking at it from a perspective of historical data. Are these documents reliable? Can we say that the miracles that are attached to the person of Jesus, not saying that they're true, but are they close? And do they set themselves apart from other religious leaders? They do, just looking at the evidence there. Now, in conclusion, to tie all this up, what we want to say is this. If you haven't put it together, the common charge that, well, the Bible was translated from this, which is translated from this, which is translated from this, which is translated from this, who knows what the original text said at all, is just simply untrue. All of this manuscript evidence that we have, it's the job of textual criticism to use all of these manuscripts, to use all the evidence that we have to just reconstruct what the original text said. And again, most scholars, not the scholars that believe the Bible, in contrast to the scholars that don't, but all of them agree that the New Testament is at the very least around 99% reliable. And of that 99%, well, of that 1%, some would even say higher. I'm giving the conservative estimate there. Some would even say, or not in some, all would say that there's just nothing that affects any major doctrine, or really any doctrine at all, in regards to the Christian faith. Again, no other religious work comes close to that. Not only no other religious work, no other work from antiquity comes close to that. You have the New Testament that stands alone in its manuscript evidence for its reliability. The New Testament stands alone in the time gap, the time frame, between when the originals were composed and between when our copies started to show up. And again, the objection may say, well, wait a minute, what about that small time frame? Or what about those copies? How do we know that that's what the New Testament actually said, even between the times of the copies, even though it blows everything out of antiquity away? We'll put up some sources again so that you can look at that. Because here's the irony. Not having the quote original is better than having the original. Why? Because if you have multiple copies, in fact, a multiplicity of copies spread out through many regions, through different countries, through different areas, among different people groups, what does that naturally create? It creates a checks and balances system so nobody can just doctor up the text to make it say what they want it to say without it being caught, seen, somewhere with all of these different places. But again, we'll give you sources to look at that. But it's actually better that the wealth of information is spread out as opposed to just hidden between one quote original document. They can easily be fixed or doctored by anybody that would want to do that. So in conclusion, we just want to look at the New Testament text in relation to every other historical document that's considered to be reliable. And the New Testament just stands worlds apart in the better sense. In a better sense, it stands worlds away from any competition that it may have as far as a historical document goes.